Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. No. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here in this distinguished company with this great idea that all of you bring not just to this room, but to your lives and the lives of so many other people as well. I don't want to take up a lot of your time with my prepared remarks because backstage is my longtime friend, Andy Young, and the two of us are going to sit here and have a little bit of a dialogue. But I want to tell you about who I am in a way that you probably have not heard before, and where I come from and why this kind of gathering is so important to me. I grew up in a working class family in South Dakota, and my father had to drop out of school at the 3rd grade, and he was mocked in town because he had kind of a learning disability. But it turns out he was taken in by a Swedish homesteader who introduced him to the idea of operating heavy construction equipment. And my dad was a genius at it. If it had a motor, he could drive it. If it was broken, he could fix it. And as a result, he always was able to find a job, even during the Depression. Then he had the good sense to marry my mother, who was a really bright Irish young woman, absolutely the most dazzling person you can possibly imagine. And between the two of them, they built this working class life for my brothers and me. They're very careful about how they spent their money and how they saved it. And they were always, in a way, passing along those values to the two of us. But my dad introduced me very early on to the idea of how unfair discrimination is. 3 biggest heroes in our household. My dad was not a big sports fan because he was too busy working. Jesse Owens, Joe Louis, and Jackie Robinson. We stopped whatever we were doing when they were involved in the news in some fashion. Now remember, we lived in all-white South Dakota, with the exception of the Indian population, where we spent a lot of time in our family working on that as well. So early on, I was introduced to the idea, the unfair idea, of the discrimination based simply on pigmentation. And I would watch my father with tears in his eyes when Joe Louis would win another fight. We'd listen to it on the radio. And it made a deep impression on me. Now, jumping forward a little bit, in 1965, for reasons I still quite understand, WSB, Welcome South Brother, here in Atlanta, Georgia, the most powerful station in the South, hired me, a 25-year-old white boy from Omaha, Nebraska, to be the 11 o'clock anchorman. And my wife and I moved here, and it was a revelation in so many ways, because we got to know the complexities of the South and the culture of the South, and got to know people like Andy Young and other leaders as well. And I was here during that very vibrant time when Selma was going on, for example, in Haneyville, and I was damn near killed in Tolliver County by a bunch of rednecks. I was the only reporter there with a cameraman. And so I began to understand what this was all about, and I understood that it was more complicated than a lot of people realized. But what I really understood was the genius of the organization, Dr. King, and the conscience that so many people had to examine for themselves about where they wanted to be in this historic fight. So I'd like to just confine my few remarks to the Brokaw concept of history in America. We have a long and distinguished and unique history, obviously. It is a country of refugees and immigrants. And the first immigrants were the founding fathers. And they created this extraordinary, unprecedented idea that a country could govern itself by law, and that people could learn to get together. They were not good on race by any means, but at the same time, they knew that what we could be is what we've become. A country in which people from all over the world would come to be ruled by the rule of law and to have the opportunity to realize all their fondest dreams, not just for themselves, but for generations to come along and their families afterwards. And so the country has been, in my judgment, a country of big ideas. imperfectly realized and originating in different parts of the country. Let me tell you about my life and how I've looked at big ideas. I was born in 1940. I'm an old dude. The first big idea of my lifetime was how FDR very cleverly prepared America for World War II. It was the biggest war in the history of mankind. Think of where we would be today if Hitler had prevailed. And he was very close to getting there until we got involved. And the sacrifices were enormous. But the country was welded together by the idea that we could not let Germany win. And when the war was over, much of it fought by young men and women who had come out of the Depression with almost nothing, including an opportunity to go to college. A next big idea was the GI Bill, in which veterans could go to college or trade schools and learn something that would allow them to earn a decent living in this country. Big idea after that was John F. Kennedy saying, we're going to go to the moon. We're going to be the first country in the world to put somebody on the moon. And that unleashed a technological revolution in this country that we're still realizing. You can say that the people who took us to the moon were the forefathers of the new digital age, as a matter of fact. Now, Richard Nixon had a lot of bad big ideas, but he had one great big idea, which was to open America to China in a relationship in which we begin to understand each other in a way that we're still working on, but it was a brilliant concept at a time when we needed to triangulate what Russia was up to by reaching out to the Chinese and developing a cultural and economic understanding. That was a big, big, big idea. What am I leaving out? I'm leaving out the big ideas that came not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. And no better place to begin talking about that than the civil rights movement, the nonviolent campaign led by Dr. Martin Luther King, his good friend Andy Young back here, and an untold thousands of youngsters, mostly black but white as well, who would curl up on a sidewalk, and I was witness to this, beaten by batons from the police. Andy was describing backstage how he was damn near beaten to death in St. Augustine, Florida, and one of our correspondents was beaten as well. But they never gave up the concept of nonviolence. And it played out on television screens, not just in the South, but for the first time, the rest of America could see the venal hatred, the absolutely indefensible attitudes of so many in the South toward black brothers and sisters who were the people who came to this country, their forefathers and their foremothers did, in chains. And they built the South. And they were an extraordinary important part of our lives. And here they were on television every night, undergoing this god-awful assault because television was a new phenomenon in terms of national news programs. Chet Huntley and David Brinkley at NBC and Walter Cronkite at CBS. ABC was not yet a player. So wherever you lived in America, you could see this heroic moral crusade that began from the bottom up. And it was, in many ways, not only difficult, but it was uncertain, and it wasn't always successful. There were internal debates within the movement. And the signing of the Voting Rights Bill and the Civil Rights Bill absolutely codified the rights, but it didn't change racism in America. Because when Dr. King moved north, of course, he was met with the worst kind of hatred in places like Chicago, where they were staring at him in the streets and his life was completely threatened. And he began to have to understand that he was dealing with something that they'd not encountered in the South. It was worse in so many ways in the North. And then there was another group of young African-American activists who said enough of this nonviolent. Stokely Carmichael, who had a very profound following, would walk beside Dr. King and say, I don't agree with that. But the movement continued. And of course, there was that god-awful day 50 years ago, next week, when Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. And he's the only non-president to have his own statue in Washington, D.C. And although it will not change in dimensions, that statue, which is so striking, it will grow in the hearts and history of this country as people look at it and realize all that he did to change the greatest cancer in America, the cancer of racism. He was able to do that. And that was a very, very important and enduring lesson for all of us. Something else happened during the 60s. The women's movement began. Women began to step forward and say, we deserve an equal place in society. That too is still being worked out. But we owe it to the women who not only started it, but to their mothers and the people who came after them, demanding that they have their place equal to men, not just in the workplace, but in society and politics and culture, in every conceivable way. That was a big idea. And this past weekend, we saw the latest example of a big idea. Young people, not just from Florida, by the way, but from across the country, went to the streets and said, gun violence must come to an end. We shall not be denied. I've been involved in this fight for as long as I can remember. I'm a gun owner. I'm a hunter. I grew up with guns. But it is so out of control now, I'm ashamed in so many ways of the people who will want to defend what we have become as a nation, heavily armed, willing to pull the trigger at any given moment. We cannot let that happen again. And the examples that I have just given to you share one other very important quality. They didn't rely on Washington. And Washington now is the worst place I can remember in my lifetime as a political reporter. There is an enduring gridlock going on there. And people have a loyalty to small bands of people with a lot of money or with a claim on a social issue of one kind or another, and there is a refusal to work across the aisle. There is a determination to have a kind of ideological warfare fought in the Beltway that has nothing to do with the rest of us. And so the next big ideas are in rooms like this, an Operation Hope, because it grows from the ground up. And that's why what you're doing is so important, because your congressman didn't tell you to do this. It wasn't somebody in City Hall who told you to do this. It certainly wasn't anybody in the national political scene. You did this out of a sense of your own fulfillment as an American citizen and what you want for succeeding generations. Moreover, you identified what needs to be done in a realistic way. You're not dealing with fantasies. You're dealing with a hard reality of financial literacy, of finding good jobs and teaching people how to put their money into the best use for their families and for the future, and giving an advancement to everyone here. Jesse Jackson, whom a lot of you know, obviously, I'm going to borrow one of his phrases and rephrase it a little bit. We were doing a story in New York about a hospital strike. And I said to Jesse at some point, sum this up for me. And he said, sum this up, it's easy for me to do that. Rich got a plan for living, poor got a plan for dying. I would change that a little bit and say, rich got a plan for getting richer, and poor got a plan for staying poor. But you're going to change that equation. And that's the next great movement that needs to happen in this country. So I stand here before you and applaud you for all you're doing. And some of you may know that I wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. It was a transformational moment in my life. I learned so much from those young men and women who fought against great odds in distant places in the Pacific and in Europe under the worst possible conditions. I walked on the beaches of Normandy, and I've been to the Far East. I've been to the other battlefields, the Battle of the Bulge. I've seen the camps that Hitler had organized in Dachau. Buchenwald, and what we were fighting against, that kind of evil. But my favorite small story out of all this is one that I want to leave with you. I met a man by the name of Sam Gibbons. He was a congressman from Florida, and he was in the 82nd Airborne. And he jumped in on D-Day as a young 23-year-old lieutenant. And he landed behind enemy lines in the dark of night. And all of his squad was scattered. They were scattered because the planes were not able to land on the plots that they had been outlined on their maps. So think about it. Here's this 23-year-old Floridian, stuffs his parachute away, knows he's behind enemy lines, doesn't see the Americans coming over the line. He has to put together a squad to carry the war to the Germans. And he was given something before he left by his commander, and all the commanding lieutenants were given this. He was given what appears to be a child's toy, a clicker. And in the dark of night, behind enemy lines, with the bocage, the forest that are lining the streets where Germans are embedded, he clicked. And he hoped he would hear, which means, I hear you, I'm coming. When he heard, that was not someone saying, are you black or white? Because I can only fight with black people or with white people. Are you a member of the Tea Party? Or are you a liberal? I'll only fight with a liberal, or I'll only fight with a member of the Tea Party. No, this meant, I hear you, I'm coming. Let's win this damn war. And they won the damn war. So metaphorically, I want you to think in your lives, even if you don't have one of these, that you, in your mind, remember its great, rich history about pulling people together at the risk to their lives in the dark of night against a great enemy. Our great enemy is racism. Our great enemy is our inability to work together as a country across pigmentation lines. Our great enemy is finding common cause. Every group giving a little bit so the next group can be happy and move on together. That's how we built this remarkable nation. And it will only continue if there are more organizations like this with more goals like what you have. And in your mind, you'll hear, thank you all very much.